Good morning and welcome to a virtual town hall on the environment. My name is Marc Favreau from Citizens Climate Lobby, or CCL, and we are your hosts for the event. I also want to note that CCL member Ann Schmidt is monitoring the waiting room in the chat. We have reserved the last 20 minutes or so of this 45-minute event for questions from our audience. Those questions can go to anyone on the panel, which includes representatives from CCL, the Electric Car Club of Connecticut, the League of Conservation Voters, and of course, Congressman Jim Himes of Connecticut's 4th District. Introducing everyone, Congressman Himes is a staunch supporter of climate and environmental protection action. He is also a co-sponsor of a number of bills related to the environment, including CCL's favorite legislation, HR 763, which would put a price on carbon and return the dividend to all the country's citizens. He also co-sponsored and helped pass the Great American Outdoors Act, and I'll let him speak to it. Congressman.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming together this morning for this conversation. It's an important conversation, as it has been for a long time, and hopefully will be in the coming months. I appreciate the opportunity to tell you how I think about things, but more importantly, to learn from you on all that you are focused on. One of the attributes of being a member of Congress is that your day gets cut up into 15-minute chunks, in which one is Syria, and the next is Social Security, and the next is Medicare, and then there's wind power, and so it's really important to get these moments to focus at some length on critical issues, which of course the environment and climate change is one. Very quickly, and I know we'll get to all sorts of different topics, but this 4-year period or 3.5-year period has been as discouraging for me as it has been for you. After 8 years of not rapid enough progress, but progress nonetheless under the Obama administration with the Paris Climate Agreement and very substantial investment in battery storage and any number of passage of the American Clean Energy and Security Act. Of course, we've been in full reverse for the last 3 years with respect to just about everything that we care about, which is one of the reasons why I think November 3rd is particularly consequential. And unless asked, I will not get overly partisan, because I think the substance here is more interesting than the politics. But let me just say that I come at this from a couple of different angles. Number one, you have seen that in the House, which is controlled by the Democrats, there has been meaningful work done with Kathy Castor's Select Committee, with a whole series of pieces of legislation that I think are good. I'm so glad you highlighted 763. I was glad to see the activity in the House of Representatives with respect to the Select Committee on the Climate. But at the end of the day, it didn't make a strong enough statement. I am a believer, and I know that there are folks that debate this, but I really am a believer that the foundational thing that we do is to correctly price carbon, and that much flows from that. And so I'm glad in particular this group put such emphasis on HR 763. I will tell you, because I want to just end this introductory portion on an optimistic note, which is progress is not totally confined to my side of the aisle. More and more we see rightward-leaning organizations sign on to the concept of a fully refundable carbon tax. More and more, particularly my Republican colleagues in places that are coastal, are coming to see very personally what the effects of climate change are, and therefore are becoming much more pragmatic about efforts to address it. The problem with that is that it's just not happening fast enough. And so we need to find a way in the coming years to really accelerate our commitment to a sustainable energy future, with all that implies, starting with a mechanism to correctly price carbon, but also developing the technology, of course, that allows us to do that, and deploying the technology, which excites me. I mean, obviously, like all of you, I care an awful lot about the sustainability of the planet and handing my 2 daughters a planet that they can actually inhabit. But one of the real tragedies here has been our stumbling commitment to leading technologically on all of the aspects that make what we need to do possible. And I won't belabor that point, but to say that we've led every other technological revolution, the IT revolution, the industrial revolution, and of course we're ceding ground on all of the technology, whether it's photovoltaics or advanced battery storage or what have you. we are ceding that technological lead to other countries, and that'll have an impact on our prosperity and the number of Americans who can benefit economically from the change that we will make. So, Mark, let me stop there, and obviously we'll drill down on any one of those topics that are of particular importance to you.
Thank you very much. Next up is Dr. Roger Kuhns, who is our CCL state coordinator and author of Navigating the Energy Maze, discussing bills needed for sustainable energy production. Dr. Kuhns.
Thanks very much, Mark. And it's good to see you again, Congressman. It's been, I think, 4 years since I saw you in person in a meeting in Washington, D.C. But thank you for meeting with CCL and your staff twice a year. Minimum in Washington and in district when we can. Yes, my doctorate is in economic geology, and I've worked in the field of geology, climate change, and clean energy resources for a number of decades now. So let me stop there and we can move on to the next person, but it's great to see you again.
All right, and next up is Barry Kresch, who comes to us through the Electric Vehicle Club, through Save the Sound, but is actually part of the leadership team of the Electric Vehicle Club of Connecticut. Barry.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Congressman and CCL. And I see a few members of the club have joined the meeting, so I thank them as well. So I'm with the EV Club of Connecticut, and we evangelize, educate, advocate, and track data regarding EV adoption in the state.
Thank you, Barry. And finally, David Bingham from the Connecticut League of Conservation Voters, he is the co-chair of that. Well, Roger, I guess we'll throw the first question to you.
Well, I had a fairly simple question initially, but in your introduction, Congressman, you covered so many things that are a huge concern to us. And here in Connecticut, we have fairly aggressive emissions reductions goals set by the General Assembly and the governor, 80% reduction by 2050. And right now, there is a lot of fossil fuel infrastructure being permitted, such as the Killingly natural gas power plant, the Yankee pipeline to connect to that, things like this. By permitting these kind of fossil fuel infrastructures, we will never reach that goal. So what is your advice to us as residents of Connecticut on how we can help you work with the state to really go to a clean energy economy on a faster pace than we are doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for the question, and I think the thought I can offer is in the area in which I have some expertise, which is a political strategy. And I've watched the controversy around Killingly for some time because it's primarily a state issue. I've sort of stayed in the background, but I've kept abreast of what's transpired up there over the years. I think the best answer I can give you to that question, because you said what is the right approach to to migrating more rapidly to a sustainable energy infrastructure. Maybe the one, having watched Killingly for some time, maybe the one valuable thought I can offer you is that energy, of course, is near and dear to every citizen of Connecticut. We saw how much that was true in the fact that, many of my constituents were out of power from, 5 to 10 days. And it was a pretty excruciating experience for them, particularly in a pandemic when kids are trying to learn remotely and for all the reasons that you know. So for people out there, this is not an abstraction. And because it's not an abstraction, I think you win the political fight and you install sustainable generation and infrastructure because you have a very specific plan to do so. So what I mean by that is some of the commentary around Killingly has been we should not build this 650 megawatt plant because sustainable energy is getting cheaper and we should be doing more wind and solar. that's not bad, but it's also not great. What we need to be able to tell people out there in the great wide world is that we have a specific plan to bring on an alternative. I don't know the ISO numbers, but we have a specific plan to bring on the alternative 650 megawatts or whatever the appropriate number may be. And that plan is not going to dramatically increase your electricity rates. And it's going to happen. So I think to win the political battle, because at the end of the day, this is a political battle with people on the other side saying we have the highest electricity costs in the country outside of Hawaii. We have an unstable electrical grid, blah, blah, blah. We need to have specific plans. So it's great to put goals out there. And though I have some minor misgivings with the Green New Deal, I defend it a lot because you have to have those goals, but it's not enough just to have the goals. You need to have the specific plan that allows you to achieve those goals. Otherwise, you're not going to shift the momentum that drives a project like Killingly. Now, I'm not knowledgeable enough about the intricacies of New England ISO to know if they're being pushed hard enough to develop the alternative plan. I do know that I get very involved in things like the offshore wind projects that are being built and hopefully, by the way, put together in the city of Bridgeport. But I don't know, I don't have enough detailed sense of ISO to know if they are being pushed to build those specific plans that are the alternatives to the way we used to do business as represented by the Killingly plan.
Mm-hmm. So just to follow up very briefly on that, we have requested from Senator Murphy and Senator Blumenthal and other senators in the northeastern states to send a letter to ISO New England, which they did last year, asking them, basically demanding them to step up their conversion to more renewables. So we have been following that track. And one of the challenges in the state is that we are disconnected in goals and plans. And so thanks very much for that.
All right, great. Let's go to Barry. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Mark. I want to start with the federal EV tax credit. We need to see a lot more EVs on the road if we are to meet the Connecticut targets in the Memorandum of Understanding. One of the things that has been beneficial to this cause is the federal tax credit for purchase of an EV that dates back to the Obama stimulus package. There's a manufacturer threshold in that law, which two important manufacturers have exceeded. Would you support recalibrating this purchase incentive to maximize support for popular EVs and avoid putting them at a competitive disadvantage, as well as consider turning it into a rebate, which would enable it to reach a lower income stratum and be a more powerful incentive?
Yeah, thank you for the question. The answer, the simple and quick answer is yes. I'm an EV owner myself and love it, and agree with the premise of the question, which is that electrifying the fleet is going to be important. And so yes, and as you're probably aware, there's a bunch of proposals out there to expand the EV tax credit, and I believe some may even be about making it fully refundable or a credit. HR2 most notably, apart from doing grants for the installation of infrastructure, would renew and create a new electric vehicle tax credit. I was just talking to my colleague Jackie Spear a couple of weeks ago, who has another bill that would renew and expand the electric vehicle tax credit. So yes, I agree with its importance. I've actually taken advantage of it, as I said. And by the way, this is my one caveat. You know, particularly when we're talking about Teslas and that sort of thing, you know, I want some element of progressivity here, right? I don't want the more wealthy segment of our population to be subsidized by the federal government to buy a very expensive Tesla. I really want this targeted at, you know, somebody, the more typical consumer who may be choosing between a traditional internal combustion engine Taurus and you know, whatever the equivalent is out there, electric, whether it's the Volt or what have you. So yes, I'm very, very supportive of that. I think we need to make this evolution sooner rather than later, and I think that along with incentivizing people to by electric vehicles, we really need to turn our attention to the other half of this equation, which is making sure that the charging infrastructure is out there. And I've been enormously gratified. I watched down here in the corner of southwestern Connecticut. I've been very, very gratified. There's a wonderful app that does show you the charging infrastructure. And we're doing pretty well in that regard, but we're not quite at a point where we have the infrastructure necessary for universal adoption of electric vehicles.
Well, just one of the things I would call out, which is more of a state issue with respect to some of those charging stations you're seeing, like for example, the level 3 non-Tesla chargers that are at the service center on the Merritt Parkway in Greenwich, they're turned off. And it's because the power costs are borne by the franchisee and they can't cope with the demand charges. So that's a demand charge mitigation issue, not really a federal issue. But so when you see some of those maps about all the charging stations, there's a lot of issues that are underneath it about keeping them operable, policing them, and so forth.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I have noticed that a lot of the charging stations, non-Tesla charging stations, they have out of order signs. I was wondering about that, and that's just a cost item for the franchisee, huh?
Right. Apparently, they didn't pay to put them in, and they kind of got them, and they got a rude awakening when they saw their first electric bill. And they don't even know that, at least temporarily, there is a demand charge waiver that's offered from Eversource. So I think it's got maybe 2 years, but they're not telling anybody about it. So we could have had a temporary reprieve, but in that situation, no.
Thank you so much, Congressman, for your work. I'm from the League of Conservation Voters of Connecticut. There is a national organization that does the scorecard on Congress. Our work that I co-chair on is, and in fact, was just off of making endorsement interviews for the state legislature, trying to be bipartisan if we can. We still have some Republicans that are running counter to what you're facing in at the national level. But our work is really to do oversight and provide a scorecard on all of our legislators. Tough in the COVID era because essentially what's happened is we had lots of bills on the floor ready to go. We would have had a very good environmental session this year when things closed shop. So all of those are in flux. One issue that's come up, as you well know, is the environmental justice situation in terms of all the compromises we had to make on environmental bills in the past. Often those compromises really impinge on the community that has the least power, and special interests have compromised many of these bills. So we still have a long way to go on environmental justice, and I think we're going to have a special session in Connecticut where that's going to come up. Mostly my concern was how much you think Congress is going to be able to do, or are we going to have to do it all at the state level? I know that you've gotten this some bills through, but it's a difficult time. So that's really my question, as to we really shouldn't be doing patchwork on toxic chemicals and on packaging and plastics and recycling, so many issues, or even electric cars. Been doing it on these things on the state level as opposed to the federal level. We wonder how much you think that you're going to be able to do there and save us from having to reinvent the wheel here in Connecticut.
Yeah, thank you, David, and thank you to the wonderful work of the League of Conservation Voters. You guys really are present and important in the minds of legislators, state and federal. So thank you for that. I closely monitor my LCV score. Sadly, we've got work to do just to get back to zero. The Trump administration has aggressively reversed many of the measures, real and symbolic, that were implemented in the 8 years of the Obama administration. So we've got work to do just to get back to a reasonable baseline on everything. And the results of November 3rd will be a big part of determining whether we can do that. One of the possible, I might even say probable, narrowly probable outcomes of November 3rd is a Democratic president and a very narrow Democratic majority in the Senate, 51, 52 seats, possible. With that configuration, I do think we've got a real opportunity to go back to making some progress. Now, if that's what happens, and I don't mean to sound partisan, I think I'm playing back the reality of where the two parties are on climate change and the environment. So I hope that we have Republicans on this call that we can call upon to sort of get that party to revert to their, multi-generational legacy of being conservationist and being thoughtful about the environment. But anyway, I just want to be careful about sounding too partisan to know, but we are where we are. And so anyway, in that outcome, I think we've got a real opportunity to make some very real progress on all of the issues that we've discussed this morning. But again, confining myself to what I know pretty well, which is sort of the political chessboard. If that is the outcome, I will, and I hope you will, have half a morning of celebration, but then realizing that the real work starts. And what I mean by that is that we will have a perhaps 2-year period in which we can get a lot done, but it will be enormously frustrating because a 51 or 52 vote majority in the Senate includes Joe Manchin, includes Mark Kelly of Arizona, includes some Democrats in some pretty conservative areas where a lot of power is generated by burning carbon. And in no way, I'm so glad that Joe Manchin is where he is, because he could get us to the 51 seat majority, but he of course represents a state for which employment in the coal industry is still pretty large, or at least in the popular imagination it is. So again, I'm thinking back to 2009, 2010, when we had 60 votes in the Senate. We had 60 votes in the Senate. We couldn't get the American Clean Energy and Security Act passed with 60 votes in the Senate. So I think you see my point here, which is that the real work starts after that glass of champagne on November 4th in making sure that we generate the grassroots pressure for Mark Kelly, who would be the new senator in Arizona, and Joe Manchin. And it's not just pressure, right? It's not just, pounding on those senators and members of Congress who are in tough districts. It goes back to what I said before. It means being specific in telling people how they don't get left behind by what we're proposing. Explaining to people that, no, your power bill is not going to triple when we have a fully refundable carbon tax. Explaining to people that that's actually a deeply progressive mechanism in which most Americans are actually probably going to see, are going to see a return costs. And it also means, I left this out of the previous discussion, it means we do the hard work of answering the criticisms. You see this with Killingly all the time. We need this plant because the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. Well, they're right about that. The sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. So we need to be forthright in addressing those criticisms. So anyway, I've gone on at greater length than I intended to, but the answer to your question, David, is yes. In that outcome, and in fact, in an outcome where we have a Democratic president and even a narrow minority in the Senate, I wouldn't rule out the possibility of progress, but the real progress happens in that configuration. But a lot of real work has to begin immediately to achieve some of the things that I think we can achieve.
Well, I certainly hope that your predictions come to fruition. Irrespective of that, do you have questions for the other panelists?
I would love to ask the other panelists so I'm going to ask that the question that I posed earlier be answered. And what I mean by that is, again, because I don't get to spend as much time on this issue as I would like, that's true of every issue for a member of Congress, but I would love to hear, I don't know if it's Roger or who it might be, but I'd love to hear somebody describe what the right trajectory is for the state of Connecticut. I am aware of the plans to construct a lot of offshore wind, and I'm very excited about that. You know, you've got several projects that are 800 megawatts or more. I'm very excited about that. I am aware of, you know, what the natural gas industry is doing in the state, but I would love to hear somebody tell me what the sustainable plan is that gets us to our sustainability goals.
Well, that's a great question, and that's one that we've been working on widely. And I just want to say we did want to have a number of high school students and college students on the call today. Senna Wazer, Krishma Lawrence, and people like this from across the state, but they are in class this morning, so they send their regards and so on and so forth. And they are working with us on what I'm about to describe. So the first thing is we do see a pricing of carbon is quite key because fossil fuels have 4 to 6 times more subsidies through a whole thousands and thousands of avenues than renewable energy does now. And so the public does not fully understand that fossil fuels are more subsidized than the subsidies they see very publicly for renewables. So that's an education issue, which really concerns the young people. They want education about climate change and this kind of energy in all of the schools as a requirement in high school and grade school. So that's from them to you. The second thing is we have to reconsider how we see the distribution of our electricity. This affects not only electricity in buildings, but also how we charge our cars. And so we really need to move to microgrids on a larger scale in Connecticut. This means business parks, universities, municipal building complexes, shopping malls, whatever that is. Because the grid, as it tries to accept more and more load, reaches out to the other states and other fossil fuel generating power stations. And this is very, very inefficient as we continue to try to repair that old infrastructure rather than reimagine and innovate on the new microgrid structure. So microgrids are key. And so in Connecticut here, of course, I live in Mystic, and in Groton, we have the Navy there. And boy, they understand they're putting solar panels up everywhere. In essence, they're working towards a microgrid for the Naval and Coast Guard stuff. And so we need to have cities have the freedom and some assisted state and federal funding to reimagine how they are powering those cities. This can charge the buildings and this can charge the vehicles. And that'll reduce the almost 40% of emissions from transportation and 21% from buildings. The efficiencies, those are key as well. They have to be retrofitted in. The other side of Connecticut, we just had a whole round of debates with the school building committee who didn't want to put solar panels on any of the 3 new schools they're building. This is a big challenge. I mean, this should be a done deal, but it's not. We got some on, but it's a small amount. So a carbon tax levels the playing field, and that has to be advertised better. And that can be done on a New England and Northeastern states basis as leading the country as well. So we are advocating for Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, and New York to do this. So the carbon tax, the microgrids, reimagining that thing, making sure we do not invest in new fossil fuel infrastructure, but take that money and put it into battery storage and things that are required to get us through peak power demands. Those are some of the key things that working to get across to the state.
So from the League of Conservation Voters point of view, I can, one of the fun things about being on this board is doing these interviews and actually sending out to every legislator running for office. And so I've read through every cycle of legislators coming in, their surveys. And I have to say, a few years ago, something like the carbon tax or a mandate on the schools in terms of education, making sure that the curriculum includes the climate change, would not have been something that a lot of people would have supported. This is the smartest group of of survey responders that I've ever seen. Education has improved. The issue of climate change is now much bigger wind at our backs. It used to be, 5th, 6th, 7th on the priority list, but it's moved up into the top 3 and sometimes to the top of the list. And in terms of the voters and the responses when we're doing the surveys, what the legislators are hearing in their home districts, and I'm sure you're hearing some of that as well. So we're going to do some of those things, and I think the support for the carbon tax is much stronger than it would have been on a survey a few years ago. People are beginning to understand the need for that much better. The Killingly issue is something that's difficult because the unions have really put pressure on some of our progressive Democrats. On the other hand, to commit ourselves to 30 years more of, or whatever the lifetime of that plant is, to a carbon thing, we're going to end up, if we do a carbon tax, punishing it for something that we shouldn't have built to begin with. So I wonder what we can do on the federal level to try to keep us from doing that and make the labor unions realize there are an awful lot of jobs in terms of all the places we can put solar panels throughout the state. We should be doing that in all of our landfills, over our major parking lots. So, I think that we really, there are so many jobs that should be done in that way. But I certainly feel that we are going to move some of that legislation here in Connecticut. I wonder how you feel about us, the state's piecemeal doing a carbon tax, or whether that helps you or hurts you at the federal level.
I have watched the whole RGGI process, which of course is a regional carbon market. And I guess my answer is it's better than nothing. And it models how this could work and what the effects would be. And most of those effects are not bad for my constituents. So I think we all know that at the end of the day, this is a global problem. So regional and local solutions aren't going to cut it by themselves. They're important to demonstrate, but obviously at some point we need not just a national plan, but quite frankly, an international plan, right? There's all this, you can easily spend days worrying about what the implicit trade effect is by imposing a carbon tax in the United States, but not having it imposed in other manufacturing centers like Mexico or Asia. So on balance, I think they're really important. The New England RGGI and other attempts like this, I think, are really important for modeling for people what it looks like. But I think, as we all acknowledge, this is a global problem, and it requires a global carbon price solution.
Did you want to add something, Barry?
Yes, I would like to focus more narrowly on electric vehicles, but something that could be done at the federal level, as well as the state and local level, is when vehicles in the official fleet are retired, that they be replaced with electric vehicles. I saw there was a proposal in one of the pieces of legislation from the House that would retire the very old letter carrier postal delivery trucks and replace them with electric vehicles, which would be a wonderfully visible thing if we could do it, not to mention significant emission reductions and nobody getting a heart attack due to the lack of air conditioning. If there is a Biden administration and another infrastructure bill gets passed, which I understand is high on his list, could some of that be used to address the charging station infrastructure question, subsidize hardware, smart chargers, which would create jobs, which would provide lasting infrastructure? There are a couple of ways you could go about it. And the last point that I want to make is that we spoke a little bit about Tesla, which is the most important EV manufacturer today. And as you know, they're not allowed to open stores in Connecticut, and they only have one service center, and that's a state level issue arising from the franchise laws. But I have also seen writing on the Federal Trade Commission blog that calls this out as an anomaly in our capitalist system, as a very anti-consumer stance. And so I'm wondering if that could be challenged at the federal level.
One of the shocking things I learned when I got into politics 11 years ago was that we like to imagine that the business community is all about demanding free markets, and we don't want regulation, and we want free markets. We want free market capitalism. Baloney. I've spent the last 11 years of my career listening to every single industry come into my office and say, we need this protection, we need this subsidy, we need this, for government assistance. And to me, the way the dealers fought back the ability of Tesla to sell into Connecticut is just, exhibit A of that sort of, competition for everybody else except me. I don't want competition. And it turns my stomach because market capitalism has its issues, but it shouldn't be about preserving legacy industries that are stopping us from innovating in the ways we know we need to innovate. So you can tell how I feel about that. I don't actually know the answer to your specific question. This is a sort of federal state thing. I don't know that in theory, the federal government could say, you must allow other models for retailing cars in your state. At the end of the day, the Constitution grants the federal government supremacy over state law and regulation. As a practical matter, that's going to be hard to do. Because I think that this, the regulation of this kind of trade at the retail level has traditionally been a state regulated thing. So I think it's theoretically possible, but practically unlikely. So I just, I have not been subjected to the pressure that the dealers have. I think there are arguments that, we have this service model and consumers aren't going to get well served. Well, you know what? If consumers aren't going to get well served, they're not going to buy those cars, right? This is why markets exist. And so I do hope that we can win that fight eventually in the state of Connecticut, and more so for non-Tesla electric vehicles, quite frankly. Look, at the end of the day, it's going to be a relatively small percentage of people who are purchasing Teslas. But okay, so that's how I feel about that particular issue. So HR2, to your other questions, I would direct you to HR2 because it does contain HR2. And by the way, I should say that in September, Leader Hoyer has said that we will be voting on elements of the recommendations that came out of the Select Committee on the Climate. So I would keep a close eye on that. They're not going to become law, but when the House does pass something, it does indicate what we might be looking to do down the road. HR2 does actually mandate that 75% of new purchases of vehicles by the post office be electric vehicles. And for their heavier trucks, it sets a target of 2030 for a third of those heavier trucks being replaced by electric vehicles. And you're absolutely right to point at the post office. That's the big federal fleet, other than the Department of Defense, which I think Roger addressed earlier. So yes, is the answer to that question. Post office is where we can really work magic quickly. And by the way, this hasn't come up, but let's connect it to environmental justice, right? Our buses and our postal fleets are spending a lot of time in inner cities, in areas of poverty. And if we, can reduce the amount of particulate matter coming out of the exhaust pipes of our buses and our postal vehicles, that's actually a nice step in the right direction for environmental justice. And then lastly, HR2 does contain a provision that would provide the tax credit for the purchase of used electric vehicles. There's a threshold. I think the value of the vehicle would have to be below $25,000. But again, in HR2, yes is the answer, that it would extend that tax credit to the purchase of used vehicles.
Excellent. That actually addressed one of the two questions in the chat. And there is one that I'm not sure which panelists may know about this, but a question about the status of community solar projects.
I would ask the congressman to put in his perspective of community solar projects first.
Okay.
You're great, Congressman, and your ideas and advice is really good, and I value it.
Yeah, thank you. I have to probably disappoint you here. I don't all I can tell you on community solar, and maybe this is for us to work together on, all I can tell you on community solar is that I'm regularly told by groups in my district that are interested in community solar that the state of Connecticut is behind on promoting these things and incentivizing community solar. And often people point to Massachusetts as a model. The last vaguely intelligent thing I can say on this is that I believe them, because when I drive through Massachusetts, I'm always impressed by, how alongside the Mass Pike and what used to be a service area, there's now, 2 acres of photovoltaics and some sort of community solar project. So sorry, I wish I could be more intelligent on that question, but I am regularly told by my constituents that the state of Connecticut should be doing a lot better on community solar.
And I might add to that, there's a perception that for community solar, you have to put it out in a big, huge field. And we have acres and acres and acres of rooftops, parking lots, big box stores. There's just all this area that is already built space. For example, I did some work in New York City for rooftop solar, and 75% of the buildings in New York City could have rooftop solar on them, powering energy for more than 500,000 people. So in Connecticut, when we look at new schools, any municipal building, it should be a city ordinance or law and a state law that the first consideration for energizing that building is solar. And that's why we work on the local level and the state level on these things. So there's a lot of ways we can put this solar into a community. And again, if you link it to a microgrid, you actually see local jobs open up. You see less loss of energy in transmission. You see a better leveling of net metering type equivalencies. And I realize the major power distributors like Eversource do not like this model, but the key point there is Eversource, although they advertise a lot of renewables, really is investing very heavily in natural gas. And so we don't see an innovative business plan in an organization like that that's truly looking forward to Connecticut that matches its emissions targets.
This is anecdotal, this is not data, but as it happens, I'm very interested in people who are making those sorts of conversions at the residential level even, and that's not quite as interesting as, an acre roof on top of a Costco. But I think the reason I bring this up is because I think there's actually something that all of us can do in our towns and communities. Without exception, and again, I understand this is anecdotes, not data, but without exception, the people I talk to, and it's probably a population of a couple dozen, who installed their own photovoltaics, say exactly the same thing, which is that the economics are compelling. The payback period for the installation, and I don't know, it costs $50,000 or whatever it does. The economics are compelling. The payback period is 2 to 3 years. That's pretty compelling. But that local zoning regulations are a massive headache, and approvals and inspections, and that Eversource and UI in some areas don't make this easy. So I think there may be some low-hanging fruit there for us to push our communities to be more amenable to those sorts of conversions, and just to make that process easier. Because look, at the end of the day, if the economics are compelling, people will go through a lot of hassle to get it done, but apparently there's still a lot of hassle.
Right. If I could just chime in here in terms of the state, I'm so glad Roger pointed out the difference between community solar, which would be the average community person's feeling about it, and these community solar fields where they're wanting to chop down open spaces, and the siting council and others are pushed into putting a community solar that Eversource would like, because they got a huge thing with just one connection on it, as opposed to, but right now they have connections to every house in our part of the state. They already have those connections there. When I put up my solar panels 10 years ago, and it has paid for itself already. Put solar hot water on 30 years ago, and it's I've had a free hot water for 30 years. That paid for itself 2 years into it, and I've had to replace some of the work since then. But when I put up my solar, I live on a farm, and my barn has room for carrying some of my neighbors, and they would have been happy to contribute to the cost of the installation and get some of the get some of the benefit from it. But I wasn't allowed to, because part of that is zoning, but most of it was the state law that the way they wrote the bill on community solar, essentially they've written off the possibility of group net metering, which is what they have in other states that allow a neighborhood to have whatever is the most appropriate place for a solar panel to go up, and all of the neighbors to share in that in a really a microgrid situation. And we need to handle this really probably at the state level, but I'm glad to work with Roger on this and see. I think Eversource has been our problem. It's a bigger problem now than it's ever been before, but it's in serious trouble in terms of its public image right now. If there ever was a time that we should be able to take on Eversource and maybe get some of this legislation through, I think their lobbyists are on their heels right now, and I'd like to get some of that legislation through.
With that, I need to play boogeyman here because we are actually somewhat over time. Congressman, if you'd like to have the last word, this is really your time that we're taking on here.
Mark, thank you, and everybody who participated. Thank you very much for this conversation. Look, I'm as you can probably tell, I'm really excited by the prospects that we have in the coming years to make some very real progress here. It is going to require, I think it was maybe Barry who pointed out that young people are motivated around this issue, around climate change specifically. It is really going to require that we get them engaged and active, as they appear to be. But I think we can really, after November, if November goes well, according to my lights, really make some progress here. We need to, again, we can't, as I alluded to before, we can't regard, a Joe Biden win as an environmental panacea, right? There are very serious political concerns around what we want done. Eminently addressable political concerns. So again, I'll say what I said before, which is we'll have one glass of champagne if the configuration in Washington looks better than it has in the last 4 years. But that's when the real work starts, because I saw that we made some progress, but inadequate progress in 2009 and 2010 when we had the presidency, the House, and a supermajority in the Senate. So thank you for all you're doing, and I will be enormously proud and excited to hopefully make some real progress starting in January of next year.
Terrific. Thank you, Congressman. Thank you, Roger, Barry, and David, and for everyone who participated.